It is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all that heavenly glory.
Go.
Okay, hi Lucy. Lucy, can you explain to us what's going on right now? The Health and Social Care Act has been law now for almost a year, and we thought surely that's all going to go ahead. And all of a sudden there's a lot of movement, a lot of anxiety and a lot of agitation around something that's happening in Parliament that's going to have a big effect on the National Health Service. What is it and why?
The Health and Social Care Bill was passed in the form as if it were an aeroplane with no jet engines. So the structure was all there. Its significance was not very plain to many people, unfortunately. They looked at it and they couldn't really understand what they were looking at, and they couldn't find the thing in it that was actually going to accomplish the privatisation. Because really the only marker of it was a little clause explaining that regulations would be issued. And now those regulations are with us, and those regulations provide the jet engines to make that privatisation go ahead. So all of the rest of the plane was put in place last year, and now at the very last minute, before this whole thing happens on 1st of April 2012, the regulations are coming into place to show that everything has to be put out to competitive markets by CCGs and the National Commissioning Board, and therefore that will create rights for private providers to supply, which will not only allow them to take quite a lot of the share of the NHS budget for their business right now, it also potentially makes the privatisation irreversible in the future because they have rights that they can sue on, created by the form of these regulations. They would not exist unless these regulations come into force.
Okay, that's a lot of information, huge implications for our National Health Service. For somebody coming to this question fresh who's very concerned, what does this mean from April the 1st, what will this mean for them accessing services and how will it unfold over the next few years for them?
Okay, now we're familiar with the kind of Big Bang privatisation model. There's a lot of different ways that have been developed by the privatisation specialists around the world over the couple of decades since the big privatisation push has been happening. And we're not going to have a Big Bang privatisation for the NHS, we're going to have a very quiet one. So what has happened is that all of the rules that control health financing have been gradually changed since the New Labour times, piece after piece put in place with different explanations for each item as to what the purpose of it was. But overall we now have the NHS reorganised in such a way that it can be relaunched as a mixed market, what is called, so not just a public health sector service, also a healthcare industry. And the rules are structured in such a way that there will be a gradual transition between those two groups. The public sector will shrink away and the private sector will grow. But because there will never be an announcement in Parliament that the NHS is privatised, and because the private providers will be allowed to use the NHS logo for anything that they are getting NHS funding for, it is very likely that the general public will not be aware that the private sector has in fact come in and taken over whatever bits of the NHS it finds profitable, until probably service provision gets very bad. But at that point, of course, the private providers just take the NHS logo off, and then they will enjoy the boost to business that will come with the terrible reputation the NHS will have by then.
Lucy, you made reference to a mixed market in the National Health Service in the near future. Why is this such a bad thing?
Well, you know, it sounds like a good idea to have diversity and options and these kinds of things, and that would be fine if it weren't for the fact that the rules of the market are thoroughly stacked. Because the thing is that if you're organising healthcare, both theoretically and practically, we know absolutely for certain that organising the thing as a public sector service is the cheapest and most effective way of providing healthcare. And that is broadly because the market model does not at all well fit healthcare. The market model depends on a tension, a power balance between a consumer and a supplier. And that market model also includes assumptions that both parties are in possession of all information about, the subject of the transaction. Well, that's clearly not the case when one goes to the doctor, because unless you're also medically trained, what you're wanting to know is what it is that should be purchased to improve your health, as well as, you know, making an arrangement to do that. So in markets where that's the situation, where the consumer has to rely upon the supplier for guidance, what you get isn't a market that clears down to a minimum price and is efficient. What you get is soar-away inflation and abuse within that market. Now, that is theoretically the case. A Nobel Prize winner published on that in 1963. It is known by all proper health economists. We also have a large amount of evidence from many countries around the world. Of course, the US health system is the most salutary warning to us, but there are an awful lot of other countries which have been had their health services privatised over the last couple of decades. Basically, there's been a sweep of privatisation of public services right around the world, applying standard solutions, and we can see that when that happens, the consequences are terrible. And in fact, there's a very interesting example in China, where as part of the market reforms, American consultants were invited over, and they made a lot of recommendations about marketising the health system, in fact, probably privatising it. And the Chinese government took the marketisation advice, but not the privatisation advice. So we there have a 30-year-old, fully state-owned, marketised health system. And interestingly, it has exactly the same problems as the US health system. It's not actually necessarily predatory behaviour by companies that are making the problem at all. It's the incentive system. If you pay doctors only when they do work, then they overtreat people. If you make sure that medical facilities have no way of making any money other than by selling things, then they become salesmen, not advisors and advocates to the public. So that's basically the problem with it. The set of incentives that have been loaded into the NHS in order to enable the creation of a mixed market, at the same time completely undermine its ability to be an ongoing decent public service. And actually, you know, in the world, we have one of the very best public services, and compared to other developed countries, it's also one of the most cost-effective. There were several of these in Europe. Sweden's has been privatised, Spain's has been privatised, ours is being privatised. In fact, on 1st April 2013, that is also the day the Spanish government signs over control of its national health service into the competitive market.
Can you enlighten us with any detail of those countries that are ahead of us on privatisation, such as Sweden and Holland? What has been their experience? Is there anything we can learn from that? Does it tell us anything useful?
We are starting to see research evidence emerge. Unfortunately, the privatisations are mainly too recent, so work is being done on sort of systematic research on this. But we do have some early indications. We have news from Holland that because their health system is now run through competition law, GPs have got into a lot of trouble for attempting to cooperate and other doctors to work between doctors to coordinate patient care, because that's anti-competitive. It looks like arrangements between commissioners or arrangements between providers, and it's illegal because it's anti-market. And there actually has been a big case on this in which their National GP Association attempted to do something about the fact that doctors are usually keener on setting up in sort of pleasant urban areas where their partners can get work, where their children can go to nice schools, that they're, you know, sort of connected kind of places where there are career opportunities also. So in every country, it is always hard to get people to go out to rural areas and work there. So the Dutch GP Association attempted to make some arrangements such that new GPs would preferentially be encouraged to go out and work in the rural areas where people were not being able to access proper care. That's anti-competitive. It involved interfering with the market, so they were forced to stop doing it, and they were made to pay 7.7 million euros for their offence of competition law, because this was held to be a very bad offence, a very bad breach of competition law. So that's £6.4 million against the National GP Association for attempting to assist patients who weren't able to access care. So that's one worrying example. We're also starting to see the picture in Sweden. And again, we're seeing this shrinkage away of services in rural areas compared to urban areas, and in rich areas as opposed to poor areas. So of 196 new providers in Sweden, none of them went to very poor areas, one went to a medium area, and 195 went to rich areas. All of those were new private providers. A lot of the public providers have disappeared, and those are the people that were providing those services. So what we are getting is an extreme example of just a polarisation of service into urban areas. This is to be expected from the theory, and that's why it's showing up fast in both Holland and in Sweden. In the Spanish system, I spoke with a Spaniard who was very worried about this a few days ago, and she informed me that they have already put in user fees. There's a standard plan, and they haven't told us what all the plan is. They're trying to stop us finding out until everything gets in place. But the later stages of the plan involve user fees, and that means that people who can't come up with €1 every time they need to go to the doctor are not able to see the doctor any longer. Anybody who's not registered with the system, so that includes various kinds of immigrants, can't get access to care at all. Anybody who is over 26 and has never held a job, apparently even if they are ill or disabled, is no longer entitled to access to public care either. Most people are required to rely on employment insurance, health insurance paid for through their job. So outside that system, people are expected to buy private health insurance. We're already starting to see some level of suffering from that in Spain, but it's very, very early days. We can expect things to develop the way that they are in the States, where you have a situation where a large percentage of the population is just permanently excluded from accessing care. A further portion of the population has insurance which turns out not to be adequate to pay out when they actually need to use it, so they're effectively in the same position except that they've already paid an insurance company for nothing. If people who do have effective insurance, if there's something slightly wrong with them, then typically the insurance company will pay out without question because that keeps the consumers happy. But if something goes badly wrong medically, such that there is going to be a large bill, then the company is faced with a situation where if it can avoid paying that money out, it gets to keep the money. So basically, the money to pay out the insured people is coming directly out of profits, and so they will fight not to pay it out. They get lawyers onto it, they get doctors onto it to try and knock out the case that people have for being able to claim. So between that system and the exclusion, and the fact that people who do have comprehensive care, the hospitals have a field day because finally somebody can actually pay some sizable bills, so they take the opportunity to get as many tests and procedures on those people as possible. You can kind of see that the whole system really is not fit for purpose. The idea is to provide healthcare for the population of a country, so you exclude part of them, you cheat another part, and some die because of it. It's just not a good system, which might be excusable if the government's claims that it will be cheaper were actually true, but it's of course several times more expensive as well. It's really very interesting when the government are telling us that this is a good thing to do, the subject of that sentence always disappears. It is certainly very good for somebody to do this, but I'm thinking it's not us.
But even if it was cheaper to run, surely there's no price that could be put on individuals' health and their health needs. So, you know, even if the government put up an argument that this was a cheaper system to run, that wouldn't be sufficient to convince people that it's a better system.
I think certainly at that point there is a debate to be had about, you know, value for money and how much we're prepared to pay and all of that. But we don't need to have that debate because the truth is what they want to do is going to be 3 times as expensive and less than half as good. It's going to be really a disaster, and honestly what it looks to me is a pretty classic rip-off. I don't really understand the concept anymore of those people who believe that our government is representing us, because it's not looking that way.
So this is an ideological attack on the National Health Service. It's a very attack on the founding principle of free healthcare for all at the point of need.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can refer to it as an ideological attack, and that works if you think of it as an attack on an ideology, but it is not derived from an ideological position. There is certainly an ideology promoted around privatisation, but that is a rationalisation to convince people who otherwise wouldn't come on board. At the bottom of it, it's about making money. There's nothing more to it than that, you know?
Okay.
I don't know. I wouldn't personally dignify greed with that term, but there we are.
Can you explain a little bit more? You made reference to CCGs and how the nature, our CCGs are coming into play from the 1st of April and what their role will be. Can you tell us a little bit about the size of the budget that they're going to be holding, the massive power shift that's going to take place, and what this means? And is there a possibility that commissioning groups can play a useful role, but not in the way that they're going to play a role?
Okay, the health service is being restructured onto an insurance-compatible footing, and the CCGs are technically state-owned insurance schemes. So they're going to be taking on around 80% of the NHS budget, and they're going to be parcelling it out to providers. And they have been told that they are going to have a lot of autonomy in that, and that they will be able to represent the interests of their patients in the matter. That bit doesn't appear to be able to be delivered when we have these regulations in place. Because what the regulations say is that commissioners will put out contracts according to competition law, and they will decide according to competition law. And if anybody that didn't get the contract feels that they don't like the decision and that it could be faulted on failure to comply with competition law, they are permitted to comply to the sector regulator monitor, which is required to enforce competition law. So what will happen is that CCG's decisions, if they don't follow the letter of how you award contracts through competition law, which is basically to the cheapest bidder, if it's on price, or the best bid, if it's not entirely on price, and it's not possible to have it without it being at all on price because there is no legal mechanism, although they have told us otherwise, there is no legal mechanism available. So once everything gets put through the market, the thing is that the CCGs won't actually have any autonomy in the matter, and they will just have the choice over to whether to leave their jobs or keep their jobs and preside over the collapse of the system, because that is what it's intended to cause. And the reason we have been told all of this stuff about GP empowerment and patient empowerment is firstly to lure the doctors into complying with this. They are belatedly starting to understand that this is being a trick, and they are being asked to betray the country. So some of them are getting quite angry about that. They certainly won't have autonomy. The whole thing will play into the usual beneficiaries of competition law, which is the authors of competition law, which is the transnational corporations. So in terms of resisting this, if one plays within the system as it exists, well, it's all sewn up. There is simply no autonomy. Because the second reason why GPs have been told that in CCGs they would have the chance to advance the interests of patients is because it's very important for our politicians that nobody blames them. So the public has been induced to believe that the GPs are taking over and will be in control. So in 5 years, when the whole thing is complete chaos and you can't get decent care, it won't be the politicians' fault. Look who is in charge.
You say there is some concern now amongst GPs, a growing concern, a growing understanding of the implications of all of this. What are GPs doing about it?
Well, some of the more sophisticated people have been very aware of this for some years, and they have been trying to raise awareness with other people. It seems that there is an increasing percentage of doctors who aren't prepared any longer to believe Department of Health or government statements on this, because too many times they've turned out not to be true. So I think there's an attempt to raise awareness, really, but it's very late in the day. We really need to get angry and loud an awful lot faster. Privatisations typically are accompanied by very considerable distress and dissent from the public. This is extremely quiet. It's astonishingly quiet. I mean, not that I suggest an uprising, but if we want to actually resist this, we really need to get serious and stop expecting the Labour Party to sort everything out, because the main strategy, unfortunately, for the NHS has been to expect the Labour Party to sort everything out.
What's the experience of the last 15 years, 13 years under Labour government there? Is there anything that the Labour government did whilst it was in power to give people the confidence to believe that they can rely on Labour to sort out the NHS?
I just they appear to have done an awful lot of things to give people the confidence, and it's very unfortunate those people are not naturally suspicious enough to have actually checked things out. There is a very good book called The Plot Against the NHS by Professor Colin Lees and Stuart Player, which sets out details of what happened to the health service under New Labour. And what they did was put out under a kind of a nanny state rubric or a helping disadvantaged people rubric, etc. A whole lot of things which are absolutely critical to this privatisation. This lot couldn't do it without what the Labour Party did, and the Labour Party are clearly still cooperating with it as well. So, for example, all of the stuff about the purchaser-provider split, the creation of commissioning within the NHS, the first bringing in of these very same competition regulations direct from Brussels in 2006, 2007 by the Labour government. All of this has been absolutely fundamental to setting the thing up. And I don't think a Conservative government could have done it because people would have been suspicious about that. I think the Labour government has been absolutely critical to the success of NHS privatisation and continues to be so. And unless we wake up...
Okay. Where does PFI fit into this, Private Finance Initiative? There's a lot of talk about it, there's a lot of anger about it, a growing anger about it in many areas where hospitals are saddled with these immense debts with huge interest payments. Where does it fit into this?
Okay. PFI is a very interesting phenomenon. While at once it is true that an awful lot of people made an awful lot of money out of that, and that can be its own motivation, it has now emerged that, of course, PFI is a critical element in allowing hospital privatisations. And the arrangement goes like this. The NHS is legally a single public sector entity. So an arrangement was made to sort of carve it up into little pieces that need to be standalone. A privatisation model was discovered in Spain from the first privatisation stuff that was happening there. And that was the Foundation Trust model. So that was brought in and a whole lot of explanations were put out for why this was a very good idea. But the point was to separate the hospitals into what looked like separate entities so that it is possible to create a narrative over whether they make profits or losses. And following that, a narrative that the ones that make losses are insolvent and should be reorganised somehow or handed to different management. Now, the NHS was, at least before all of this started to happen to it in the 1980s, actually rather well run and very efficient. And so pushing those units into losses so that they could be set up to be privatised later isn't an easy thing, really. You have to have some kind of millstone to weigh them down. So PFI came to the rescue. The PFI deals were big infrastructure financing deals where the private sector was asked to pay for hospitals, tied into long contracts which often include their ongoing responsibility and right to provide things like maintenance services, the actual running of the hospital over a long period. So there's a large income stream locked in for a long time in the future. And the way that this was put to the country was that this would allow the government to take borrowing off balance sheet, and that would be better. Now, why the hell the country stood for that arrangement, I don't know. The idea is that if they borrowed more money to rebuild the hospital infrastructure from the public borrowing requirement, which is of course extremely cheap, it is the cheapest way to borrow money at all, then that would make Gordon Brown look bad. Therefore, he got his bankers to do these deals. So instead of paying interest at a few percent, maybe 3% or 5%, Gordon Brown signed us up to deals for 50%, 71%. I believe those are the rates at the SLHT, 2 PFIs. We don't have details, of course, in general because of commercial confidentiality, but it is very plain that the rates for PFI are in fact usurious. Now, that was explained to the public sector at the time as, oh, well, these rates are really high, but of course all the risk is in the private sector, so it's worth it. Firstly, that level of risk premium is completely inappropriate anyway in financial terms, and really they should have got professional advice that could have told them that instead of believing it. And secondly, when you look at the contracts concerned and when you look at what was told to the private sector, a completely different picture emerges. Gordon Brown went on record at a private health industry meeting as assuring the investors that PFI was fantastic for them because it had great returns guaranteed by the government and no risk at all. So he was overt with them and told the public something different. And when you look at the contracts, all the risk stays in the public sector and all the benefit goes to the private sector. So a lot of people, presumably in some way connected to the people that came up with all of this, have made a lot of money over a couple of decades by now. And the PFIs have thrown those hospitals, which are constricted now by what income that they can make from selling services to patients, because that transformation already happened under New Labour. Our doctors have already been turned into salesmen of pharmaceutical products and surgical treatments and whatever else they can flog off to us to make money. But you can't sell enough pills really to cover an enormous PFO like that. So there we are. The narrative is ready. And an awful lot of the public has accepted, for example, that isn't it terrible, South London Healthcare Trust, it's insolvent, and so we need to take urgent action and it's okay to privatise it maybe. Perhaps it'll be better run that way. The whole thing is frankly fraudulent.
So this has been a long planned, a long time coming, step by step, I think, ideological attack on the National Health Service, dating back to perhaps the Thatcher era, certainly the Major era of the late 80s, early 90s, when John Major introduced PFI. Is that a reasonable sort of view of it? That this is a long plan?
I think the timing's absolutely right, and I'll give you a little more detail on that, but I really would take issue again with the term ideological. From the beginning of the plan, which Thatcher put together, there was a thing in The Guardian a few weeks ago talking about that. She had a team working on it with the Centre for Policy Studies. John Redwood and Oliver Letwing were key players in that, and they were at the time also involved in the NN Rothschild Merchant Bank's International Privatisation Unit as its senior staff. The thing is that the banks are actually behind all of this, and banks don't have a lot of ideology, they just have profit motive. So, you know, I know that there are politicians that have been peddling the lines that the banks tell them, but they are just a way of smoothing things through. The ideology is the sugar that makes the medicine go down. Beneath it all, there's just people trying to make money that have managed to sew the system up. So we have an absolutely beautiful write-up of the Thatcher Plan from the Adam Smith Institute in 1988 called The Health of Nations. And once you strip privatisation propaganda from it, you get the most extraordinary framework. It contains a detailed set of instructions to take us from the NHS as it was pre-Thatcher through to a fully privatised US-style system, step by step. We're about 80% of the way through that plan at the moment, and you can date every single initiative going through from the tail end of Thatcher, the major government, right the way through New Labour, step after step, being neatly put in place with different explanations for why each one is being put in. We're about 80% of the way through. So this is very interesting because you can see the other 20%. We can see which way this is heading because it's all explained very, very clearly. And so the CCGs are being set up according to that plan as state-owned insurance schemes along the model of American health maintenance organisations or accountable care organisations. That's what their insurance models there are called. So that will create a way of the private health insurance aligning alongside the system. And the intention is to organise things so very quietly the private health insurance industry can take over the worthwhile business out of the CCG. So the CCGs will be left with the ill people and the poor people, and the private health insurance industry will be collecting premiums from the rest of us and paying out when it's forced to.
You make reference to the US-style health system. You say this has been part of the plan. We're 20% away from getting this plan implemented. Can you, without sounding alarmist, without scaring anyone, can you kind of illustrate what this might mean? I mean, there's figures that there are something like 50 million people in the US who don't have sufficient or any private healthcare insurance to pay their healthcare bills. There's stories about people being bankrupted to pay for their children's healthcare. I mean, is this just hysterical scaremongering, or is there some basis in this?
No, I mean, this is all absolutely true, and you can see it plenty of other places around the world as well. In the main hospital in an Indonesian city that I worked in, you go to the public health clinic in the morning, but all that ever happens is the doctor tells you to come back in the afternoon to his private health clinic. It's kind of used as a screening and patient gathering exercise, the public health sector. It does no healthcare any longer because it has no funds to do it. Those kinds of arrangements are fairly usual. But of course, the US is the most extreme example because there's an awful lot of state money being funneled into it as well. They have a large subsidy to US healthcare, which provides not very much healthcare because unfortunately an awful lot of the money gets captured on its way through the healthcare markets and the insurance markets.
Okay. Can we go back to, we've certainly done this already, can we go back to Section 75 and the regulations and what
Sure.
we might do about it. Okay, so you've explained that there's now this rush on to get these regulations in place. They're going to have huge implications for the National Health Service. What can we do? Do we stand frightened like rabbits in the headlights, or is there something we can do at this late hour to prevent this from happening, or at least to put a halt on it temporarily? What can we do?
We need to raise awareness in the country urgently and to everybody, and we need to stop having silos about, oh, well, you know, we don't kind of agree with those people, so we won't talk to them. We need to get the word out urgently to everybody in this country, because everybody in this country is being cheated. You asked just now about whether the situation, the talk of the situation in the US is alarmist. There was a useful film by Michael Moore called Sicko. It's extreme, but actually, from everything I can understand from people in the States, this is sort of normal, and there are an awful lot of people in the States who are desperate that we hang on to the NHS so that they might have some chance of getting one. They're seeing the European health systems crumble away into privatisation, and they're getting more and more desperate that they're ever going to have anything that's really, you know, appropriate to a civilised country, honestly.
Okay, so get the message out all around the country that this is happening to the National Health Service, that we've got less than 40 days now to stop this regulations going through. Realistically, are there any mechanisms by which we can stop this going through?
All standard mechanisms have been captured. We need to break out of the system if we're to do anything.
For example?
The parliamentary system is sewn up so that it's not going to produce any change.
So what is what is the possible mechanism for change on this?
I'm afraid I don't have any definite answers. There are discussions going on about what we might next do because new information has emerged in the last 24 hours. But for now, the main thing everybody must do is talk to everybody, write if you can, tell people, bring people to see film and video clips. Just get the word out to everybody as fast as possible, and please stop putting faith in the Labour Party. They definitely are not on our side. Not that the others are particularly either, though I believe plenty of grassroots Liberal Democrats are pretty upset. Their leadership is not aligned with the grassroots for that party.
Wouldn't that be true of a lot of Labour Party members too? I'm sure there's lots of grassroots Labour Party members, trade union members, who are horrified by what's being disclosed now and what's happened. And I'd make a distinction between them and the leadership of the Labour Party.
Well, you may be absolutely right, but I have to say I'm seeing an awful lot of left-wingers who still hold the faith, and I think it's very unfortunate because their faith will sell the rest of us out. It's been like taking candy from a baby, honestly. I'm very upset that candy is my healthcare provision.
On the 1st of April, people are talking that the NHS is now going to be in the thick of being a privatised service. What exactly does that mean?
That's a little bit of an overstatement. It's not suddenly overnight going to turn into a privatised service on 1st of April. What happens on 1st of April is a bunch of legal changes and a bunch of operational changes which affect the way that the NHS functions internally. In general, this reform is a health financing reform. So we're taking away the original, or finishing the transition away from the original form of funding of the NHS and moving into a market system which is going to be full-on market.
Okay, so it's full-on market. This means people are going to be competing contracts, profits are going to be made, and is profit going to be the driving force as opposed to patient care?
Profit is already the driving force as opposed to patient care, even within traditional NHS hospitals. And this is because they have taken away the normal kind of funding that you have for a public service, where you get an allowance to keep the buildings going and to pay staff and this kind of thing. All of that funding has already been withdrawn by the government through to hospitals, and we have a US-style system already put in place, directly copied from the US. Which amounts to piecework for doctors. The more they do to us, the more they get paid. So they have to earn their money that way. And this system will now make that completely compulsory. So not only can NHS spending be put through markets, all of it will have to be put through markets. So the nature of the change is that firstly, the internal system within the NHS has been rearranged to make it possible to make money out of it. Because once you've done that, then competition law binds, and the competition law then sets up an arrangement whereby the private healthcare industry can gradually come in and pick the cherries out of the budget. Basically, what they want is patients with simple problems that they can mass produce. They basically have a kind of a production line approach to healthcare. They're not interested in making people well, they're interested in treating some people so that they can make some money from that. So that's the reorientation we're seeing. There won't be a sudden change, but there will be a new set of legal arrangements which will cause certain things to happen more than others. And the things that are going to happen include a lot of private providers coming into the health service and a lot of public providers going bust. Because every time the public provider of a service does not get the contract to carry on providing that service because a private provider has got it instead, that service will be shut down permanently because there won't be any more money to pay the staff and to keep the lights on. So gradually, this system will kill off all our traditional NHS providers, apart from maybe some big names. I'm expecting Great Ormond Street to survive. I'm expecting the Royal Marsden to survive. There are a few other really high-profile hospitals around the country where the brand name is so valuable that they might carry on. It is intended that all our NHS hospitals be pushed through the Foundation Trust pipeline, which is an arrangement organised by competition regulator Monitor to privatise all of our hospitals. So all of our hospitals that aren't yet Foundation Trusts are being turned into them, and the Foundation Trusts are being pushed out into the private sector. So there is an intention that within a few years there simply will not be any public sector health provision, either because it's been driven out of business by a stacked competition, or because it's just been straight privatised by Monitor.
What's the big deal though? Rich and wealthy people have forever used private medical care, private health care, and have benefited very well from it. Now we're going to have that. What's the big deal?
Well, actually, you see, we don't really have a proper private health insurance scenario in this country at all, because the private health insurance only offers certain kind of transactions. They like to keep it simple and they like to keep it profitable. So if there is any kind of problem where somebody's got two illnesses at once maybe, or they don't react to the drugs well, so you have to kind of find other solutions, or if there's any kind of complication really, the private hospitals don't deal with those people any longer, so they just refer everybody back into the NHS. So the private healthcare industry in this country has just been a little bit of a luxury bolt-on, but of course you can just go back into the NHS whenever needed. And of course also, private healthcare does not like running accident and emergency services because the risk-profit profile is bad for them, so they never touch those. We will never have probably privatised A&E. We may not have very much A&E at all in the end, but that will probably be within the public sector because it doesn't fit their model. So in this country, private health insurance is thought of as a very effective, good luxury. But if you start running the whole system relying on private health insurance, you get a very different picture, and this we can see from the States. Because they don't want to give a full service, and in fact they don't want to give any service at all if they can avoid doing so. What they want to do is to take in a lot of insurance premiums and then keep them all. So they're actually set up to make it very difficult for you when you're actually seriously ill and need a serious amount of money to pay for that treatment. They are actually set up with mechanisms to try and make it hard for you to get them to pay what they owe you under the contract you signed with them. They do things like getting hold of your medical records, which is one of the reasons for concern about uploading of doctors' patients' records into some national arrangement where companies can buy access to the data. Because what they'll do is they'll go through your medical records and find something you haven't declared. So in the film Sicko, there is a case of a woman who had a yeast infection many years before. It was trivial, it did a couple of weeks. When she got cancer, her insurance company cancelled her contract on the grounds that she'd lied, so it wasn't valid. So she got her insurance premium back, but got left with a bill of, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars for her care.
The big losers in this move towards privatisation are going to be long-term sick, cancer patients. What about people who have within the family a disabled child, a long-term sick child? What are the implications for a family like that?
Well, it does depend a little bit what kind of subsidies the government decides to give us, and those vary from country to country, and they haven't been announced yet because there is no claim for them yet, because people don't understand what's happening yet. So it's hard to be very clear about it, but it is very definite that in the States, almost 2/3 of bankruptcies are caused by unpayable medical bills. And academics who've worked on that have said that if you look at the people that fall into those medical bill caused bankruptcies, The typical people that get into that state are families with disabled children, because the child needs a lot of ongoing treatment, and because it's a chronic condition, it's not insurable. People in this country seem to believe you can use private health insurance for everything, but the truth is they're not interested in anybody that's going to cost them money. So they will certainly make sure that if you are already ill, they charge you a lot, and usually they will exclude ongoing conditions. So the fact is, the idea that people have that private health insurance pays for all medical care is straight wrong. What it will pay for is your first treatment of newly arrived conditions. To some extent, if the private health insurance industry, or the private healthcare industry offers those kinds of treatments. So it is very, very partial and very skewed, and frankly no use whatsoever to anybody that actually needs a lot of medical care. It's a great way for the insurance companies to make money, but it's a terrible way to deliver medical care.
Okay. You talk of private providers coming in to take over services and public providers losing out in a new commissioning setup post April 1st. Who are these private providers? Are they health experts? Are we getting to concern ourselves with here? Or are they a different kind of organisation that are actually profit simply?
Right. Well, under the rules of competition law, it's not permitted to really restrict your providers. So I think they have to be creditworthy. There'll be a credit check on these companies. They have to operate equal opportunities legislation. They have to have CRB checks if that's relevant to the patient group that they're dealing with. But a lot of them are general outsourcer companies, really, that can just see a useful income stream, and they have to kind of jump through some legal loopholes. So they're not people who have any kind of commitment to public health or public welfare or the individual welfare of patients. And, you know, the government has been very careful to muddy the water here and make out that a public healthcare provider is pretty equivalent to a private sector healthcare provider, but actually their goals are completely different. In the public sector, doctors attempt to arrange to have enough money to treat the medical needs of the people that come to them for help. The purpose is treatment, and the money is a means to an end. Once you move into the private sector, company law forces company staff to prioritise making money for the shareholders above everything else. Not only can they be fired if they don't, they're breaking the law. The whole system is about making money. So whenever a private healthcare company gets involved in providing healthcare, it doesn't even have the option of putting the patients first. It's required to put the profits first. So in this case, the treating of the patients is a means to an end of making money. So you've basically got really two completely different systems, and the government is very keen for us to see them as equivalent, but they're not at all. And as a healthcare specialist and somebody who's financially trained, I'm very careful about private healthcare facilities, and when I go to a public healthcare facility, I want to know before I start how it is that those people are being remunerated, because that way I will see if they're going to try and distort their behaviour away from a disinterested attempt to help me, which is what I have been used to traditionally from British health services. But I know from elsewhere in the world that if you're sent to a doctor and they're being paid a fee, then what they tell you is whatever they think is going to maximise the fee, unfortunately. And in China, where things have gone to a really dramatic state with this, I was told by an American who'd worked within the systems there, within big city hospitals for 12 years, that they don't have a discharge policy. And a discharge policy is where all the doctors that deal with a patient's case, and you know, other therapists and so forth, they get together and they say, is this patient ready to go home? Do we need to keep them longer? Can they go now so we can use the bed for somebody else? Now that process apparently doesn't happen in her experience, because there the patient stays until they run out of money. If they're well, then they're given vitamin treatments or IVs or something like that to keep them in the bed and paying. And if they haven't got any money, then they're gone. And that is in a state healthcare system in a formerly communist country where, in fact, people are actually rather concerned for each other. They're pretty community-minded in many ways, the Chinese. So the poor doctors who have to operate this are really very upset. They're almost as upset about it as the patients are. The system is just not fit for purpose because it has a set of rules in it which cause things to go wrong. In the case of the Chinese healthcare system, they did a market reform. They stopped funding their hospitals and started paying them on piecework, which is exactly what we're in the process of doing here. And so we're expecting to see the same kinds of results. A lot of people not able to access care because care is about making money, so if you've not got money, then forget it. And the people that do access care being exploited and mistreated. And really what we need to do is move back to a public service model in which things are arranged so doctors can help people who are ill. At the moment, this reform is taking us in quite the opposite direction.
True.
Well,
Shall I stop it for a bit?
yeah. Just thinking,
This whole business about Lewisham Hospital, it's not even Lewisham that got into these fake financial difficulties. That's the most extraordinary thing, because, you know, all of these hospitals are supposed to stand alone and be punished for making losses, and that's their whole narrative. But suddenly, when the private sector didn't want the bits that they were offered at SLHT, they started looking in the next borough, and suddenly it's all one system again. That's interesting.
yes,
And really something more effective could be done to fight on that point, I think.
We're really concerned in the campaign that we don't come across as being parochial and saying this is not our problem, this is their problem, why are you making us suffer? Because it's an NHS problem.
Sure.
This will be replicated.
But it's a national decision
Yeah.
to have made this completely false narrative, which, I mean, of course, the government didn't think up on their own. It's the privatisation industry which has come up with this whole plan. And you can see its fingers all over everything, because you get Labour politicians parroting stuff which is directly out of management consultancy reports from management consultancies which are pushing the privatisation very, very hard. This kind of narrative seems to have entered through everything, and people aren't questioning it, and that is what needs to be attacked. Because people are accepting in SLHT, and I've been involved quite a lot with the other meetings on that, I've met the TSA and so forth, they're just accepting this fake narrative. That, oh yes, well, it's very sad, but we have to accept it because it's broke. Well, it's not broke. It's been made to look broke, so let us challenge this. And I think that's particularly important for Lewisham, of course, because there is no rational reason, well, there's not a rational reason generally, but it's particularly outrageous for Lewisham. And it's like a robber baron has come into town and, I want that one and that one and that one, and I'll have them. And the government just runs around, yes sir, how can we make that happen for you? The government's job is to shut people up that notice what's going on.
So there's a growing interest and concern inside the Save Lewisham Hospital campaign about the wider picture for the National Health Service. So this is happening locally. Yes, we want to save our hospital. Yes, we want to mobilise as many people support that. But I think there's a growing understanding that this is happening in Lewisham, but it's going to be replicated all over the country, and it's got huge implications. Mm-hmm. One of the things that local people find it very hard to understand is as to why we in Lewisham are expected to pay with our services because we're being told the neighbouring borough has huge unmanageable debts that are causing them to be bankrupt. What's your understanding of all of this? What's your picture?
Well, that's a convenient rationalisation which seems to work pretty well on people. People have bought into this, and I just think you need to challenge it because it's very clearly not what's happening. There appears to be a shopping trip going on by the private healthcare industry to work out which bits they'd like. I understand Lewisham is going to have an elective care centre, which I'm sure will be privatised immediately. The thing is that I think it's a mistake to think of this as a one-off thing, that you make this effort now and you save Lewisham Hospital and then it will be saved and then it will carry on. Actually, even if you win on a local level, what you are going to be doing is getting yourself a respite for a couple of years. Because overall, this is scarcely going to be the last. Not only are you not going to have very much of Lewisham Hospital and have a maternity unit which is dangerous to use because there is no emergency service on the premises, and you don't have an A&E anymore, so you will get deaths because the people are being funneled through an urgent care centre, which is really basically little more than a band-aid station. It's a first aid post in most countries' views. And the government is pretending that that's proper medical services, but it's not. You'll also end up finding that GPs quite soon won't have enough money to give you the care you need. So they're going to have to start rationing, and it's going to be difficult for them to do that. So that you'll find that people then get very upset with their GPs because they can't get things that they used to get. Postcode rationing is going to start up on a scale never seen before, and there will not only will there be no mechanism to sort it out, but it will be illegal to try and sort it out.
I thought patients were being given, or people in the community were being given the opportunity to sit on CCG, clinical commissioning group boards, to be able to influence and put pressure on those boards and those board members. Is this not going to be a mechanism where we can guarantee?
There's lots of accountability mechanisms built into the system, particularly the system called Health Watch. And as you say, there are lay members on CCGs. But if you actually look at what any of those people are allowed to do, it becomes plain what the truth of the matter is. So I'm not familiar exactly with the responsibilities of the lay members within clinical commissioning groups, the CCGs, but I am a little bit familiar with what's going on with Health Watch. Health Watch is a replacement for, I think, what were called links, which also seem to have been rather less effective from the fact that their management was outsourced to the private sector some time ago, so they already were very much captured because they were being run by the private healthcare industry. But the Health Watch England is even weaker. If you look at what it's allowed to do, it's not allowed to question health policy or the implications of health policy. And its rights are limited to the right to compose and send a letter. There is no right to have the letter answered or actioned, but they are allowed to write letters. So this is the system whereby the public will be able to ensure that the NHS works in an appropriate manner. So I think you can assume that all of the accountability mechanisms are going to be like that. They put them in because that convinces people that it's all very democratic. But actually, when you look at what recourse those organisations have, it is very, very plain that they have all been set up to be toothless in the first place. Furthermore, Health Watch England has been set up as a subgroup of the Care Quality Commission, that continually scandal-hit organisation, which is failing to do quality inspections in an appropriate manner. They are understaffed. Most of their inspectors have got no medical training, and then they don't seem to think it's very important to have medically qualified people. What they're there to do is to tick the box that the regulation has been done, and it is not desirable for the people who are behind all of these reforms, of course, that the regulation actually be done. So then you've got the situation where the public regulator, Health Watch England, is a subset of the Care Quality Commission. It's a subcommittee of that, under the control of the Care Quality Commission. And of course, anything that Health Watch England is going to be complaining about already represents a failure of function of their parent body. How much are they really going to be allowed to do anything about it? The whole thing is really very neatly sewn up so that it looks like an accountability mechanism, but cannot be operated as one. And this is why I say that if we actually want to get the NHS back, we must stop having faith in following the systems as they have been set up, because the whole thing is stacked so we will definitely lose. We need to make enough disturbance to all of this that we can force things to start being done in a different way, because the current system is completely hopeless. You cannot succeed by using it. If you want clear accountability for National Health Services, then you don't try doing it through Health Watch. I'd recommend the local paper would be much more effective.
And what I'm interested in, even if Labour are saying and give a commitment to repealing the Act, they've got the get-out clause when they get in there for it to be just so bloody unwieldy and dangerous from the point of view of capital and moving money around and paying off contracts because they're going to be in breach of them.
Yeah.
They're not going to do it, are they?
I am not a betting woman, but I would bet everything I have that that Act will never be repealed by the Labour government, because if they were inclined to repeal it, they wouldn't be trying to con us into making sure it goes through. It's just... I find that people's faith in the Labour government, having already set things up so that this position was possible, suddenly thinks they're going to change side and actually start representing the population's interests. It's just a very odd thing to think, I find.
Okay, but I think we need an explanation as to why it's going to be very hard for any government, even if they've got a will to do it, to reverse
Sure.
it. Okay.
Right, yes, okay, so there are 2 points there.
Yes.
Firstly, this government, the Labour Party clearly does not have any intention of doing this. I'm sure that there are people within the Labour Party who definitely want it to. In fact, I know for a fact there are, but they aren't in control of things. So they're not going to get their way. As regards why there wouldn't be a repeal, even if we were somehow to get politicians into Westminster that are actually trying to come up to the standards set out in their job descriptions. The reason is that if you operate the markets through competition law, if you have a competition law regulated market, that creates rights for private providers. Now, it's very interesting that in Prime Minister's question time yesterday, so that would be the 27th of February, David Cameron said that we have to have the regulations in place because without them there would just be, an uncontrolled, chaotic market, and that would be worse. Well, I don't think it would be worse, actually, because it wouldn't create any ongoing rights for providers to sue should they be forced to stop getting money from that market. I would really rather have a straight-up, unregulated free market. It will be less disastrous. The reason that they're so keen on having a competition law regulated market is that that is how the private providers gain rights. And that's where the lock-in comes from, because if you attempt to renationalise, then they just say, well, we'll sue you. And so with all of these multiple legal threats for enormous sums of money, under a set of legislation which these same corporations designed in order to do just this, really, in practical terms, it's not going to happen, no matter who's in charge. This is irreversible. We must stop it before it happens.
Okay,
we mustn't let it go through.
April the 1st, when we haven't stopped it, it's all takes up the we can do.
Well, no, it doesn't work like that, because it's not like all contracts are going to go out on that day. The rules lock in on that day.
So once the rules have locked in, Lucy, from the 1st of April, is there anything that can be done to prevent the private market or the market governing our health service from then on?
Those rules could be taken away again. The problem comes when the contracts are awarded to the private sector. So at the moment, an awful lot of things are being done by traditional NHS providers. But we will now have a regime where everything has to go out to tender, and the private contractors are considerably advantaged in winning those tenders.
Why are they advantaged? What gives them the advantage?
They designed the rules. They designed the rules. Basically, the tendering process happens. You have to pull together an application, a bid. Typically, it's about that thick stack of A4. It's quite highly technical, legally, financially, and operationally. So just having medical knowledge isn't enough. You really need people who are very, very good on the legal and financial staff and are experts in bid preparation. So private companies, and I've taken contracts with some of these private companies in other fields, what they have is a dedicated bid team. They have a bunch of highly specialised technicals who do nothing but search for bids to apply for, prepare the bids and pull in the externals, the external consultants that they need to pay to get exactly the right technical expertise in.
What sort of consultants would they need?
Well, I was hired as a medical technical specialist. But so, for example, if it were a contract for, hearing aid services, you get in people who are very experienced and knowledgeable about that. You'd bring in a set of people to plan the service out.
That's on top of lawyers and accountants?
Yeah, it's on top of lawyers and accountants. So they have their core team of experts, and then they bring in the extra experience, basically cash in hand.
It's a process. It's a big investment for a company to do that.
Yeah. And I'm also, at the moment, working with somebody who's in a social enterprise, an ex-NHS social enterprise. And the story of their bid collation is really very different.
That's a not-for-profit organisation.
So it's, yes, I believe it is a not-for-profit organisation. Not that what the government is calling social enterprises necessarily are that at all, but I think in this case it is. And their bid team consists of one individual with no relevant training, spending her evenings and weekends flat out over a few weeks. Now, you can see that the product of these processes is likely to be different. And you can also see that the CCG commissioners may well recognise that the second actually is liable to represent something that is going to be much more slated towards patient needs than this terribly slick, glossy, standardised bid that they have from the private sector. The commissioners do know these things, they're not stupid. But unfortunately, in the competition law rules, the bid has to be judged on the content of the tenders, and if it seems not to have been, the losing players can complain to Monitor and Monitor will come back and reverse the decision. So, unfortunately, because the new system relies on a very, very expensive and labour-intensive bidding process and then requires success in that to be the criterion of whether or not the bid is won, in fact, that's one of the reasons why it's stacked. Now, there are some other reasons why it's stacked, of which the most fascinating was released to the Health Select Committee at the end of last year. It's in Hansard, you can see the write-up. And what it consists of is a discussion between the members of the Parliamentary Health Select Committee, which include a number of people who are really very disturbed about all of this and do ask some fairly pointed questions. And a question was made by the Tory MP, Sarah Wollaston, who is herself a doctor. And despite the general Tory position on this, she's clearly not very comfortable about it and has had to have her wrist slapped a number of times by her bosses, I think. But she started asking questions about cherry picking to the economists in charge of Monitor. And actually that edition of Hansard is really very interesting because they have been very, very frank about a lot of the problems in the system, these economists from Monitor. They're much more honest about it than the politicians that are supposed to represent us have been. And they explained that in order to resolve the cherry picking problem, which is that the private providers only take the bits they can make most money out of and ignore everything else, because it's recognised that that does advantage them, a special mechanism has been put in place which uses what's called a local tariff facility, which is indeed in the Health and Social Care Act. And when I first saw that, I knew that this is the kind of thing that they were going to do with it, although it hadn't been announced. The arrangement is that where a provider has been cherry picking, the CCG commissioners are going to be able to say, well, since you don't offer the full service and the full standard tariff is set up to reflect a provider which does offer the full service, you need to drop your prices if we're going to give you the contract. If Monitor approves that, then the CCG and the private provider can make a deal to have a special lower tariff, allowing a competition on price, which the government said would be impossible. And that means that the private providers can systematically undercut all of the public providers on price. And every time one of those contracts is lost for the first time into the private sector, it means that the public sector capacity to deliver that service disappears because there's nobody to pay the ongoing salaries. So this is really a very, very important mechanism, and it goes directly against the assurances that our politicians gave us. And from things like this, documented by the senior officials concerned in the parliamentary records, we can see the truth of what's happening.
When it became kind of widely understood that CCG is going to be holding this huge part of the budget, a massive shift in power, there was not accusation, but it was said that doctors stand a good chance of really benefiting from this and becoming quite rich out of it. Less emphasis is put on that now. Is that because of the contractual?
I'll tell you why there was emphasis on that and why there isn't emphasis now. In fact, some very interesting things have been happening on that point. The privatisation model is actually laid down in writing in a pretty standardised way. It's been done in a lot of countries, and they know how to do it. And so there's a model for it. And in fact, this model is laid out beautifully in Oliver Letwin MP's 1988 book, Privatising the World. So this... Are you taping this or not?
Yes.
Well, he's managed it pretty well. A lot of money's been made, really. And there's a bunch of things you do, and part of the things you have to do is set up fifth columnists. And we have a lot of them. The medical colleges have been captured, the trade unions have been captured, which is why they're pathetic about all of this. Parts of the medical profession have been captured. So it was necessary as part of the narrative setting this up, along with pretending that Lansley wrote this law, because he didn't, it came out of Brussels, it would appear. There was a lot of pretending. Where am I with this? Sorry. Doctors making money out of it, yes. So they needed to get what are called the entrepreneurial GPs. There are a bunch of people who are trained as doctors that do not really have very much public spirit public service ethos or altruism or anything like that. They're just interested in making money from it. So Lansley hooked up with a bunch of those, told them that they would get rich, and so they got dollar signs peeing up in their eyes, and they sold the rest of the doctors out. And we have seen what the potential is for that from the takeover of Harmony, which is a referral gateway servicing CCGs, by Care UK recently. I believe the doctors who started it, 2 GPs, made £48 million from the sale. So there is money to be made if you are the right kind of parasite. But actually, those parasites have now gathered that they're being stiffed as well. So we now have a very interesting situation in which there are 2 groups of GPs who are on the warpath. One large group, which is very, very concerned about their ability to do their jobs in a proper manner and the effect on their patients and the population, and the other group of whom thought they were going to cash in and have realised they've been tricked. So there is money to be made, but you know, there's a lot of talk about the distractions. So GPs being empowered and autonomous is one set of distractions, but we've got a whole load of other themes like that to take people's eye away from of what's really going on. So the idea of GP autonomy and the entrepreneurial GPs is another one. And in David Cameron's question time yesterday, it was Hunt made a statement about this a couple of days ago. Who is it? Who are the big Section 75 bogeymen? Is it whiz kids helping disabled children? Blah blah blah. The whole reason that they have allowed the charity sector in is so that they can talk about the charity sector and pretend that there isn't this enormous behemoth of private healthcare industry, which is not only waiting to pounce, but has in fact set up this entire business from the start.
So presumably in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, the private sector, the charity sector and the social enterprises will not be.
They'll have gone bust.
Yeah. They'll have gone somewhere else, doing something else, or be no longer in existence. And I also presume that the private sector will be better fine-tuned, and it will be bigger organisations that are running bigger chunks of healthcare. Is that not likely to be a model or not?
The healthcare won't be run in the same way as presently. They'll do it all in the way that makes them the most money, so it will look different. It will just look like the US system and not like what we've had previously. So, I mean, I'm sure, you know, the actual physical infrastructure won't change very much to start with, and certainly the logo will be the same. But the entire ethos and way of doing things and likely outcomes and transparency, all of it, that's going to be different.
What does this mean? So we've got lots of fragmented care, some privatised, the cherry-picked stuff privatised, the profit-making stuff privatised, the less profitable, the more nitty-gritty, the more needed stuff, perhaps, more long-term stuff will be there in the public sector still.
But with not enough budget to actually do it any longer.
I was just about to ask, what does this mean for? We've got a massive growing concern about the demographic changes, about the elderly growing older and staying older, longer, living longer, etc. What does this mean for elderly care?
Is this on?
Yes.
Good, right. This is fascinating, actually. Recently, I was contacted by a Saudi student who had signed himself up to do a health financing PhD and was a bit nonplussed as to where to start. So I met with him and he explained to me what's been going on in Saudi on the healthcare front. And they are also part way into pretty much the same privatisation, starting with an NHS similar system. Their NHS similar system has been turning in, from what I saw of the official statistics, which looked credible to me. I mean, of course they could be made up, I haven't gone and checked, but I don't have any reason to suspect that there's anything wrong with them. They don't read like marketing puff, they read like a bunch of doctors trying to do their jobs. So, and from what I heard from this Saudi citizen, they do actually have a good healthcare system. And it's on the same basis as ours, and it costs them $375 a year per person. That's about a 15th of what we spend, and it would be about a 50th of what the US spends. And so they're in the process of converting it to an insurance-based arrangement, and then an official, this is already explained, that there's going to be privatisation in the end of all of it. And they have been given a narrative about why this should happen. And he had also assiduously collected together all of the health financing literature on his country. And I found at the back of it a report by McKinsey, and I found that all of the academic papers were quoting stuff out of McKinsey that was not scientific evidence. The whole thing looked really, really skewed. It was not proper academic work at all, but that is all there is. So the narrative that the McKinsey report put forward and all of these academics parroted is this. There's increasing technology in the world, so there's more demands on health services, and there are increasing demands on the system because of the demographic position of Saudi. You know, it's got a special demographic position, which means that privatisation is a good idea. Because you see, in Saudi, there is a high fertility rate, so they have a very young population. Therefore, we must privatise. And I was really struck by this because there's a whole set of conditions, all of which we've been told, except for the young population bit, because we're told that because we have an ageing population, we must privatise. Now, in point of fact, Saudi does not even have a particularly young population. There are 2.9 babies per woman, and actually that's not much beyond replacement. So the whole thing is fraudulent on a number of levels. They also explained that the reason for NHS privatisation in Saudi was that the oil price was falling, so the country was getting poorer. Actually, what you have is a curve of oil price in which it did that, and they took data points at the first peak and the trough so as to give exactly the opposite direction. So this whole thing, maybe because there's less public scrutiny of things in Saudi, because there isn't very much in the way of civil society, was plainly a complete sew-up. And it was just such a similar one, and it's just made it so transparent that this narrative should never be treated as anything but the come on for a con trick, really. The point of it is to mislead us so we agree to things. It would be really, really helpful if people could stop listening to what the government tells them and what the Department of Health tells them about this and starts looking at the laws and the experience in other countries. We will get the truth from those things. The reason they're telling us things that don't stack up is because they're intending to mislead us. It's really time we wised up a bit. It's happened too many times. Can we please stop being caught by the same tricks? In terms of PFI, the story goes further back than I have started it with, really. The PFIs were set up by John Major originally, and then kind of carried through by New Labour, who appeared to have not too much objection to them. But why were the PFIs necessary in the first place? Why was the hospital infrastructure in crisis? Well, that also is part of the standard privatisation arrangement. What you do is you run your public service down over a matter of years. You give it ridiculous tasks to do that it can't do. You hamper it structurally, but overwhelmingly you cut the budget so it can't do things properly. And one of the things that was done is just a complete dearth of any infrastructure investment in the NHS for many years. We knew that the hospitals were falling apart and that they weren't fit for purpose, but nobody did anything about it. Now, you can put that down always to each year, political expediency, everybody thinking about now and their next re-election, we don't want to spend the money now. So it could have been something that just accidentally built up, but it did so awfully conveniently, and one must bear in mind that this is a standard component of privatisation. And if that's the case, it becomes clear that actually we're even looking at a longer timeline. McKinsey started becoming important in the NHS in 1974, 1975. And so maybe that's a sensible date to be looking at. I'm about to embark upon a study which looks at this in a kind of a more, well, a better framed way, or in a more systematic kind of a way. At the moment, I'm familiar with some of the work and I'm understanding how some of the themes are put together, but I could maybe give more information on that later. What is plain, though, is that this has been a long-term plan with things set up in a predictable way such that the outcome is likely to be privatisation of the NHS.